Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature and Science Podcast, where science does care what you believe. I'm your host, Don Murphy. We explore the science behind the latest technological developments, ask the deep questions about existence, and seek verifiable truth leading to a clearer view of reality. Speaking of truth, in this episode, we will explore the truth and consequences of the firing of National Park Service seasonal employees. Joining us is former National Park Seasonal Ranger Rosanne McHenry. Rosanne has worked as a National Park Ranger and a California State Park Ranger in many different locations over the years, including the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, Mount Rainier National Park, Auburn State Recreation Area, Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park, and Death Valley National Park, among many others. Serving as a park ranger gave her a unique opportunity to talk to people about our natural world and to instill a deep sense of stewardship in each person she has met. This beautiful planet, our Earth, is our shared heritage, and we all play an important role in protecting it. Rosanne, welcome to Nature and Science Podcast.
Thank you, Don. Happy to be here.
It's great. So tell the audience what led you to become a ranger in the first place.
Well, when I was a child, camping with my family and going to state parks and national parks, and we had all these really fun adventures as a family. And then I met some national park rangers that I thought were particularly inspiring. And I even had an epiphany one day, which I talk about in my first book, where we had met this amazing park ranger, and just the way that people followed him everywhere he went. They hung on every word he said. And I thought, what is it about this man? And so I went on all those talks, and I realized he had park ranger charisma. And he just had this ability to connect with people and connect them to the earth and all of nature. And in that moment, as a teenager, I realized in that moment, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a park ranger, just like that park ranger.
Well, your
And so that,
story tells our audience just how important park rangers are in the lives
yeah,
of people, and particularly young people, and how they can be inspired. And
yes,
that's how you got your start. So,
that's right.
what park was that you worked in, went to first with your family, where you saw this ranger?
Well, the park that I saw the ranger that inspired me, that was Olympic National Park in Washington
Right,
State. It was in the
right.
Hoh Rainforest, which is just an astonishingly beautiful place
Yes, it
with
is.
tremendous connection, to the natural world. And so there were endless opportunities to enjoy nature there. But I started in national parks. I was working I was a student at San Francisco State University, a geology student, and there was a notice on one of my professor's walls saying, anybody interested in working for the national parks, please meet me. So I went and spoke to him. And, at that time, that was the early 1970s. There were very few women even
Mhm.
allowed to work as park rangers at that time. And so I went and talked to him, and he said, you go out to the Marin Headlands, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area is a brand new park that's just getting started. They're looking for people to go out there and talk to the public about the natural environment. And so I started as a volunteer, and I worked there as a volunteer for about 6 months. I went out every weekend and did guided walks and talks on the natural history and the cultural history of the area. And then they hired me after 6 months. They actually offered me a job. Oh my gosh, Dawn, I was so excited. And so I started back then, and I think it was like 1974, and I was just thrilled to become a national park ranger.
No,
So,
I understand. So, what
yeah.
was it about the job when you first started working? I think our audience would love to know what it is about seasonal park rangers that are important, and why you as individuals so love the job that you do.
It was well, that at Marin Headlands, that was a generalist seasonal ranger job. So we did a little bit of everything. We did vehicle patrol, horse patrol, foot patrol. We did cliff rescue. We worked in the visitor center. We did everything to not only protect the park, but to connect with park visitors, to talk to them about the importance of the environment and how we're all stewards
Right.
together in protecting our natural world. And so it was our job to convey to park visitors that important connection to the
Right.
natural world and also to our history, because there's a tremendous amount of cultural and military history out there, cultural history with the Native Americans who once lived in the area. So we made a real huge effort to connect with park visitors and just share the importance of, the connectedness to that resource.
Well, and it also had to do with protection and public protection and safety too. I mean, you were working
Absolutely.
near the Marin Headlands, and I think you remember in the 70s there was a National Park Service ranger who was murdered in
Yes.
the Marin Headlands, and you must remember that. And so, being a seasonal ranger and a ranger, period, especially if you're a generalist ranger, as you're
Yeah.
describing, is also a public safety job and can be
Right.
dangerous.
It could be, and it often was. And, as a seasonal ranger, I didn't have law enforcement powers, but I would talk to people about the laws and the rules in the park and how important it was for them to obey those laws and rules. And many times we'd see people tearing up the resource, and we'll have to go over and talk to them and convince them why what they were doing was damaging the resource, and also tell them that there would be consequences for their action if they failed to stop. And then we
Mhm.
would call law enforcement rangers to the scene. So we were the eyes and ears, the first on the scene, the ones who were really out there watching what was happening and
Right.
stopping people from not only from committing crimes in parks, but just from, impacting the resource in a negative way. A lot of times people didn't really understand that what they were doing was harmful. I mean, people
Mhm.
come from cities and from, urban environments. They don't always understand the importance of protecting our park resources. And so it was
Mhm.
our job to explain that to them, as well as to ensure that not only were they being safe for their own well-being, but to protect the park itself and how important that
Well, that's
is.
very true. And you mentioned protecting the park resources. So let's do a thought experiment. Let's
Mhm.
imagine that you don't go to work one day and all your fellow rangers don't go to work one day. What are some of the things that would happen to the park if you and your fellow rangers were not there?
Well, and I've seen this happen not only in national parks, but in state parks as well. And when we were down on staffing levels, all kinds of things happen. I mean, you had restrooms not getting clean, you had trash building up, you had people not, and sometimes not even being able to go to the park because they would close it due to lack of staffing. You had damage to the resource in terms of people driving out into areas with vehicles where vehicles weren't allowed, and tearing up, entire fields of, could be wildflower fields, it could be natural marshland, wetland areas, meadows. They could be, I mean, one time, one of my craziest law enforcement encounters when I was a state park ranger, we did have law enforcement ability there. One of my craziest encounters was I bicycled down a bikeway and checked on an environmental campsite, and there were two guys tearing up a picnic table, chopping it up to use for firewood, which is
Right.
outrageous. But
Yes.
those are the kinds of things that happen when nobody's there to stop people. All
Right.
of those things. And when I hear about what's going on right now in today's world with cutting back on, national park rangers and national park maintenance staff. And I can just imagine the kinds of impacts that we're going to see and the damage to the resource that can result if we're not there to stop that kind of behavior from happening. It'll
Well,
amount
Roseanne,
to,
you have a lot of experience working in
yeah.
both national and state parks, and I
Mhm.
know our listeners that I mentioned it in the lead in. You and I go back 30 years, uh, working in state parks in particular, and during that time there was a tremendous budget crisis in the state of
Right.
California. State parks had to go through cutbacks, which unfortunately I was blessed or cursed with leading, however you want to
Yes.
look at it. And the point I'm making here is that there are different ways of doing things, and they're being seem to be penny wise and pound foolish in the federal government at this point. And I think I have a right to speak on this issue since I've led so many uh, parks on a on a very high level, on an administrative level,
Right.
and you don't cut public services.
No.
You don't bite the hand that feeds you. I mean, these are taxpayers and taxpayer dollars that are going to support these parks. The parks belong to the people. And so
Right.
we have a situation now where if they were doing what was right at the federal level, they would be looking at efficiencies in other places, but certainly not in public service. So tell us what you think is in the hearts and minds and souls of people that, like yourself, that have worked in these environments. What are they going through, both physically and emotionally?
Well, I can speak from experience, Don, because as I lived through all of those budget cuts and the threat constantly when I was a state park ranger of my job possibly being cut, and also for the national parks when I wasn't sure each season if I was going to be able to return to the job because of budget cuts. So I can speak personally to how upsetting that is, not even knowing if you're going to have a job from one day to the next. And the heartbreak of your job actually being cut out from under you. I mean, it's just unconscionable. And I mean, beyond how it feels to those individual staff, I just think about the impact that that's going to have, on our actual park environments. For every dollar that we save by not hiring someone, we're going to be paying back in hundreds or thousands or ultimately millions of dollars in the types of damages that can happen, probably will happen, if we don't have the staff out there to protect parks. Now, I understand there's other areas of government that are inefficient that probably need to be looked at more closely, but our national parks are not one of those places. I mean, the National Park Service is already cut so thin, they're
Mhm.
so marginalized in terms of the amounts of staff that they have. And every year it seems there's less and less. So to cut it further, to me, it's just egregious, and it's going to result in resource damage. It could result in park visitor safety issues. I think it most certainly will. Because let's say somebody goes out and decides to climb El Capitan and
Mhm.
then they get into trouble. Who's going to
Mhm.
be there to help them? Who's going to go out and search for somebody who's missing? Who is going to be there to respond when somebody has a serious first aid accident? I mean, I constantly responded to all those kinds of issues.
Mhm.
And I can't tell you how many times I administered, life-saving first aid to people. So, and protected people sometimes from each other. I mean, you
Yes.
get a mix of people in a park, and sometimes it gets inflamed, and people start getting angry and fighting. And if you're not there to break up those fights, then serious injuries happen. I mean, I worked in some of the most high law enforcement parks in state parks when I was a law enforcement ranger, and I was constantly on the move. It didn't matter what time of year it was, winter, summer, spring, or fall, things happened every day. And we never knew from one day to the next what kinds of issues we were going to be facing in
No,
terms
I
of
mean, that's
public
absolutely
safety.
right. And I think that people don't understand that there are various levels of rangers that work in the park. You talked about being a generalist rangers and the
Mm-hmm.
various jobs you had to do, but there are resource rangers. I
Right.
think one of the areas that I think is a very good representation of what can happen in national parks from both a public safety point of view and research damage point of view is at Yosemite. And you mentioned climbing
Yes.
El Capitan. I mean, there are
Right.
literally tent cities that are there almost year round with
Yes.
climbers.
Yes.
And there are rangers that are responsible for maintaining the order, for doing the permitting, for leading the rescues when those climbers get themselves into trouble,
Right.
mediating fights between climbers, which I've seen happen when somebody
Yeah.
invades somebody else's space.
Yes.
Um, so that happens on a regular basis, and I say this in the context of many people thinking that a ranger is really a cushy job, and I'd love to do that job because I'm out in the environment and it's a beautiful place, but it's a hard job, isn't it?
It's a very difficult job, constant challenges. You never know from one day to the next what you're going to run into. So you're right, Don. Very right about all of that.
So Tell us, let's switch reels and talk about on the positive side. What's
Hmm.
been your greatest joy while being a ranger? Because I mean, there's a connection with the people that you mentioned already,
Hmm.
connection to the land. There's something transcendent about protecting our natural and cultural resources and being
Yeah.
able to facilitate people getting a sense of wonder. I mean, in that context, what's been some of the
Yes.
most positive things you've been involved in?
I think the thing I always loved the most, Dawn, was just connecting with the park visitors and going out there into the park and actually greeting them and leading guided ranger walks and talks and doing night sky programs and just making that connection with nature, with our world. I mean, this earth, this beautiful planet, it belongs to all of us, and we all play such an important role in caring for it. We all play a role in its stewardship. And I think the most rewarding of all is connecting with a child.
Mhm.
And that picture that I sent to you of me standing with those two little girls, that was at Death Valley National Park. I worked there 7 winter seasons, far more recently, actually, in the 20 teens, about 2008 to 2016. And just connecting with children and seeing the wonder in their eyes and realizing that you're instilling this sense of shared ownership of our beautiful planet and our critical responsibility for helping to protect and preserve that, our shared stewardship of our world. And just seeing that look of wonder dawn in their eyes and realizing that you've made that connection with them. So I think that just connectedness to park visitors and also hearing about it afterwards. I mean, one of the most touching things that ever happened to me was there was this note left on a board after I'd given a talk, and I didn't know who it was from. So it said, please, this is in the day long before email and cell phones, please write to this person. So I wrote to him, and you know who it was. I get back this letter from a 9-year-old little boy. And so we corresponded the entire summer, and he said he would like to grow up and become a park ranger. And when you make a connection at that level, that's essential. That's
Mhm.
amazing. That's so incredibly special and critical. So
Mhm.
I think that
So it's come
connected.
full circle. I mean, you were
Yeah.
inspired by a ranger,
Hmm.
and you were able to inspire someone else to want
Literally.
to
Yes.
follow that, and that's
Yes.
critically important to what we do as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that your first camping experience, or one of your first camping experience,
Hmm.
was at Pfeiffer Big Sur State Park in
That's right.
California.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you knew this, but I was superintendent there for a few years as well.
Oh, wow.
And
That's awesome. I love that
so
place.
that leads me to segue into you've written a couple of books about your experience. Tell us about these books that you've written and why. I think one is I think your first one was Trip Tales about
Yes.
camping with your family, and then you wrote a book about your experience as a California State Park ranger.
Yes. So Trip Tales was the first one. It's called Trip Tales from Family Camping to Life as a Ranger. And that talks all about how family camping adventures with my family as a child inspired me to become a national park ranger. And I worked at first at Golden Gate National Recreation Area at Marin Headlands, and then later 2 summers at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. And so I talk about those early experiences as a generalist and as a naturalist ranger. And there's a lot of really funny stories, both camping with my family and later being a park ranger. And people read those stories and they love them because they say that the style of writing brings them literally right inside the stories and they feel that connection to the parks.
Yeah.
The second book is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I certainly agree, and it's interesting that one of the first stories that you tell is about you camping at Big Sur and
That's right.
feeding marshmallows to the raccoons, and then your father being bit by one of the raccoons. And that's an instance where there's too bad there wasn't a ranger around because then a ranger's job would have been to protect your father from doing something so silly. And
Yeah,
and I got
thinking
a
that
kick
he's
out of the
making
fact that you kids found it funny as well, even though it could be a dangerous situation.
Yeah, yeah, I love to tell that story, but in the context of why we don't want to feed wildlife, what can happen if you do, but not only what can happen to you personally, but why it's important not to feed wildlife, how you actually cause them harm when we think we're just making a connection. So yes, Big Sur, we went there many, many times, and I learned a lot about what it meant to be a park ranger when I was there, even as a child. But yeah, that's an absolutely beautiful place that we still really love going to. And so yeah, Trip Tales was my first book. My second one was it just came out last year. In fact, I just republished it again this January. And that is called Tales from a Rogue Ranger. And the reason I use the word rogue is because if you're going to be a law enforcement ranger in state parks, you have to be intrepid. You have to be ready to face anything at any time, any day of the year. You never know what you're going to be getting into from one day to the next. It could be something like answering a school child's question about what's that flower over there, park ranger, or it could literally be a knockdown drag out, in a all out riot on main Granite Beach at Folsom Lake. And in my career, I've run the gamut from simple naturalist talks to literal knockdown drag out roll arounds or taking weapons away from people and everything in between. And so the second book talks all about what it means to be a law enforcement, and I should say public protection, state park ranger, and all of the crazy things that park rangers get into. And also how it was our job, even as we were getting into that nitty gritty knockdown drag out, to help the park visitors understand, how important it is to respect park rules and regulations.
Well, I
So
think in one of
E,
your books, you also talk about, I think it's in this book, you also talk about the fact, and I think it's important for the public to understand that parks are a favorite place for people who are in distress and who are depressed. And many
that's
of
right.
them go there to end their lives. And park rangers end up interfacing with
Yes.
people who have hit rock bottom and
Yes.
are in the process of wanting to take their lives also. Did you have that
Yes.
experience
Yes, I did.
interacting
Both
with people?
my husband and Vern, who was also a park ranger, and I have both had many of those experiences. And I do describe one of those in my book about this poor young man. I don't think he was much older than 20, and he was wandering around in the South Yuba River area, and he was completely out of his mind. He had run out of his prescription medications. He was wandering around on a really hot day, and he was getting heat exhaustion. He probably would have gotten heat stroke. And it took all of my skills, all of my communication skills to finally convince him to come with me and get in my vehicle so I could take him to county services to get him the help that he needed, to help him get his prescription drugs, to get him evaluated, to give him water, get him hydrated, get him to safety. And park rangers deal with that all of the time. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've talked people out of harming themselves or help people who've already harmed themselves through some hapless accident, setting broken bones, stopping bleeding, getting them to medical assistance, stopping young men from jumping off bridges and breaking their skulls open, on a
Mhm.
rock that's in the river. I mean, we constantly attended to, public safety issues and teaching park visitors to protect themselves.
Mhm.
So that was an essential part of the job. And again, I think if we see these services cut, these are the kinds of risks that we run that people who truly need help won't get it. And it's not just park rangers. I do want to acknowledge, the park maintenance staff, the park resource staff, everybody that works together, the admin staff, to keep parks open and running, and how important it is that we all work closely together. I mean, I worked with some incredible maintenance staff that often came to my rescue when I needed backup, and the rangers were all out on other calls. And so to have a
Mhm.
resource ecologist or a park maintenance person come and help me countless times. So we all had to work very closely together and provide those essential services.
Well, I think it's important, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it's worth emphasizing that rangers have a variety of jobs. There are a variety of classifications within the umbrella of ranger, and maintenance workers are standouts in our national parks.
Right,
They are the ones that keep the restrooms clean, that keep the infrastructure working, and many of them are seasonal employees. Many of them
that's right,
work in conditions that are absolutely horrible, where they don't have adequate housing, for
right,
example, but they love their jobs. They love the people that they work with. They love serving the public, and it's really important. And as you mentioned, you have your resource rangers, your interpretive rangers who are responsible
right,
for communicating the joy of being in the outdoors, from one park person wondering what this particular flower is, to what these tracks
right,
happen to be in the sand,
right,
to what the weather conditions are going to
right,
be.
right.
And so the job is varied and extremely important. And people, I think it's interesting how human beings are. It's like we take for granted those things that are the most important.
We do. We do. And it's our job as park rangers to convey that importance and to try to resolve any problem at the lowest possible level, meaning not, so much being an enforcer as being an educator. Sometimes you had to be both. But first and foremost, being an educator, helping people understand how this is for all of us, and it's on all of us to take care of it.
Right.
And it's on all of us to support that and to support the need for park staff and make sure that they're there to protect our beautiful places that are so
Well,
important to all of
in
us.
that context, and we'll probably wrap it up with you
Mm.
answering this question that may be a tough question, but what would you say to a representative of Doge who came to, and that's the Department of Government Efficiency, that has somehow has miraculously appeared on the
Mm.
scene? But what
Mm.
would you say to that person, or even to the President of the United States or the head of that office? What would you tell them uh, to convince them that what they're doing is not on the right track?
A lot of what you said in your previous podcast, I thought was very eloquent. And actually, it's interesting you should ask, Don, because I plan to write to my congressman and to talk about the importance of not cutting these positions. And I think the transcript from what you said just the other day, or the last podcast you produced, has a lot of very helpful information. And talk about the stewardship, talk about protecting our parks, our resources, talk about protecting the park visitors who, could become lost or injured. Talk about conveying the importance of protecting the precious resources that we have, and what will happen if we don't do that, if those staff aren't there to make sure that the parks stay open, to make sure that the restrooms are clean, that the trash is collected, that people aren't destroying the resource, that people aren't jumping off bridges or falling off cliffs, or that if they do become injured, that we're there to rescue them, all of those things. But I think that the key message I would convey is stewardship and protection, and what will happen if we're not there to provide those services.
Right. And moral, and human beings have a moral obligation towards this stewardship, which I mentioned in my
Mm.
last podcast. I mean, this is really a moral issue. I mean,
It
if we
is.
can't do the most fundamental thing as human beings, which is to provide stewardship and rise to the occasion and use our intelligence and our sentient ability to interact with the world around us, if we can't do that in a way that protects those resources, then that's an act of immorality, almost bordering on
Mhm.
evil. That's why we are here. That's our job as human beings. And that's what we really need to communicate to our leaders today.
Yes, and also the importance that parks play in our understanding of our world. It's when we go into parks that we truly make that connection to the natural world and realize how important it is to all of us. And if we lose that connection to our natural world, that interconnection with nature, then we lose our connection to our world, to our planet, to our earth, to everything that's truly the most important. Because when it comes down to it all, our planet is all we have. I mean, we're all alone in the universe on this tiny little blue marble. And it's on all of us to take care of our world, because if we don't, it's never going to be the same. And so it's
Well, that's a
essential.
wonderful place to leave it.
Yeah.
It's just been a joy to get reacquainted and talk to you again, Rosanne. We go back
Yes.
more than 30 years, and I remember the first day you came in my office with great enthusiasm about your job at Coloma, where gold was discovered in California, and wanting to communicate the importance of that particular historic park, because it's also the history that we communicate to people. So it's just wonderful getting reacquainted, and I can vouch for what a great ranger you were and still are for our national and state parks. Thanks so
So
much for
much,
joining us
Don.
on the program.
Thanks. It's been a tremendous honor and wonderful to see you as well.
Thank you for joining me on Nature and Science Podcast. You can support our national parks by letting your congressional representatives know that you want National Park Service seasonal employees rehired. You can subscribe to the podcast at natureandsciencepodcast.com. I want to thank all of our National Park Service employees for their dedication to preserving our natural and cultural resources. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.